Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us here at KFF as we give you a demonstration of the U.S. Global Health Budget Tracker. Before we do so, I just want you all to know that this presentation is being recorded, and a recorded version will be sent to you via email later today. Next slide, please. My name is Adam Wexler. I am Associate Director of Global Health and HIV Policy, as well as Director of the Global Health Budget Project. I am very fortunate to be joined here today by my colleagues, Stephanie Ohm, who's a Senior Policy Analyst with the Global Health and HIV Policy team, as well as Anna Rao, who's a Senior Data Analyst with the Global Health and HIV Policy team. Next slide. Throughout this presentation, if you would like to submit a question, please click on the Q&A icon below, and you can submit questions for the Q&A session at any time during the web briefing. And we have set some time aside at the end to answer as many questions as we can. Next slide. So we've been doing this work in tracking global health for a long time. And the U.S. Global Health Budget Tracker is actually something we've had in place for a while, but we're very excited to highlight a number of new features that we recently incorporated into a relaunch that just occurred last week. But before we get to the demonstration, a bit of background on why we do this work. Well, first and foremost, the U.S. is the largest donor of international health assistance. As you can see here, the U.S. accounts for almost 1/4 of total health assistance. And that is just bilateral funding. So that doesn't include U.S. funding for multilateral organizations such as the Global Fund or Gavi. Next slide. In addition to being the largest donor, the U.S. has really prioritized health within its broader foreign assistance envelope. As you can see here, more than 1/5 of U.S. foreign assistance is directed to global health activities, far outpacing other donors that report data to the OECD DAC. Next slide. So what is in this large envelope of funding going to global health? Well, the first thing to point out, and I know that many on this presentation are already very well aware of this, the U.S. Global Health Budget is discretionary funding, meaning it's appropriated by Congress on an annual basis for a range of health programs carried out in low and middle income countries. So this funding is really determined annually by Congress and shows what the political commitment is to these types of activities and programs. And Congress provides funding to numerous departments and agencies that support this work, including USAID, the Department of State, NIH, CDC, and DoD. And within the state and foreign operations budget, there are multiple accounts that support these activities, including global health programs, economic support fund, development assistance, and the international organizations and programs account. Next slide. The funding that's directed to these departments, agencies, and accounts support major programs in a wide variety of areas, including disease-specific programs such as HIV, TB, and malaria, population-based programs, including maternal and child health, nutrition, family planning, reproductive health, and also global health security programs, which has seen a significant increase recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this funding, which is determined annually and supports a wide range of programs in lots of different departments and agencies, is something that we track and try to do the work for you and provide a number of resources that we hope you find useful and helpful in the work that you do. And so now what we'd like to do is really get to the meat of this presentation and give you a demonstration of our U.S. Global Health Budget Tracker. First, I'll hand it off to Stephanie, who will give a demonstration of some of the existing functionality we have in place, before handing it over to Anna, who will give a demonstration of those new features that we're very excited to show you here today. So thank you again for joining us, and now I'll hand it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Adam, for that background context. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie, and before we get into the newest features of the Budget Tracker, which is really why we're here to show you the new features that we recently added, I wanted to give a quick overview of the existing features. This Budget Tracker was launched a few years ago as an interactive tool designed to show you the latest data on U.S. funding for global health. As Adam mentioned, KFF compiles these budget data, which are otherwise not very easily accessible as they come from a variety of different sources. but we have it all here for you in one place in what we hope is an easy to access format. So let's look at the tracker. This is the budget tracker's main page. The data that power this tracker include all U.S. global health funding through state, USAID, CDC, NIH, and DoD. And as Adam mentioned earlier, there are many different ways to look at the global health budget. In this overview section, you can look at the budget by a range of fiscal years, funding type, so that's regular appropriations or emergency funding. And emergency funding is supplemental funding appropriated in response to outbreaks like Ebola, Zika, and COVID-19. And by program area, otherwise known as sector. If you scroll down to the table provides a breakdown of all the data included in the chart above it. And you can expand the table here to see details on agency, account, and additional detail. The next tab shows U.S. global health funding by agency. And you can see here that state accounts for the largest share of U.S. funding for global health. Again, you can customize the chart and table using filters on your right-hand side. So say you wanted to see how much funding for global health was provided through states through regular appropriations. You would make your selections here and have your results. We'll skip over the by geography tab for now, as this is our newest feature and Anna will take you through that later, and go to the next one, the bilateral multilateral breakdown. Bilateral funding is funding that is provided directly to or on behalf of country recipients. So in short, that's country-to-country funding. And multilateral funding includes funding provided to international agencies and organizations that in turn designate which countries or areas funding is provided to. You can see from this chart that most U.S. funding for global health is provided bilaterally. Again, you can customize the table and chart on your right-hand side. And in the table, you can see details on funding for specific multilateral entities. So for instance, UNFPA, the Global Fund, UNAIDS, etc. Next, we have the PEPFAR tab, which tracks PEPFAR funding since its inception in 2004. PEPFAR funding includes funding for bilateral HIV, TB, and the Global Fund. Again, the customization options are here on your right. And finally, we have the annual budget process tab. This table tracks the U.S. global health budget throughout the budget process and appropriations lifecycle, from the president's request to the House bill, to the Senate bill, and finally to the enacted bill agreed to by Congress. We update this tab at every budget milestone, and the next update will be sometime this month for the president's FY24 budget request, which is slated for later this week on Thursday. So I've gone over the existing features of the budget tracker. Anna will now take you through the newest tab and features.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that overview of the existing features of the Global Health Budget Tracker. I'll now show you our latest additions that we're very excited to introduce you to. First, we'll go over the By Geography tab. We added this section as a way to allow stakeholders to easily access and analyze country-level global health funding data. So first, I'm going to walk you through the data source that powers this view, and then how to actually use the tool. The data powering this view is from foreignassistance.gov, which is the primary source for U.S. foreign assistance publicly available data. This data is pulled to filter for only global health funding through USAID or the State Department, as these account for the vast majority of global health funding. Additionally, we only filter to select country-identified recipients. Looking over the tool, you'll see a map showing country-level funding amounts and a chart showing aggregated country-level funding amounts disaggregated by fiscal year and health sector. As an example, if you're interested in knowing how much funding a country had received for a specific sector, let's say Nigeria for family planning and reproductive health, You would use the filters on the right to make your selections. And you would have your results. You could also use the year filter to look at more recent data if you were interested. We also present country-level funding data by USG region and World Bank income level. First, we'll go through the USG regional classifications. Here you'll see a chart showing country-level funding grouped by USG region and fiscal year, and a table below showing this same information. Again, to walk you through an example, let's say you're interested in knowing how much funding Sub-Saharan Africa had received for HIV/AIDS. You would use the filters to the right to make your selections. And you would have this result. Lastly, we present the data grouped by World Bank income level. This view is very similar to the view shown on the regional tab, but grouped by World Bank income level. As another example, let's say you're interested in looking at low-income funding for malaria. You would use the filters to make your selections. And you would have that result. Lastly, I want to walk you through another new feature to our Global Health Budget Tracker, which is the user guide. We added this section as a way to allow users to better understand and access the data presented in the Global Health Budget Tracker. So first, in the About the Global Health Budget Tracker tab, you'll see it is organized by the tabs presented in the tool. In each tab, you can see more information about the notes, sources, and additional detail presented in each view of the interactive. We also have instructions on how to download the data and figures presented in the Global Health Budget Tracker. These instructions allow you to access the data as a spreadsheet, or if you're interested in the figures, as an image or a PDF. Going back to the About the Global Health Budget Tracker tab, you'll notice that we have an email address listed. We've added this as a way to encourage users to reach out if they have questions or ideas or suggestions as they use the interactive. I'll now turn it over to Adam to facilitate our Q&A portion.
Thank you, Stephanie and Anna, for giving us that overview. They literally just scratched the surface of the different ways you can cut the data in the Global Health Budget Tracker. So we encourage you to go online and use the tool and let us know what you think. Please offer suggestions if there are ways we can improve, or let us know of any questions about things you might like to see within the next iteration of the budget tracker. So now, if you have any questions, please let us know, or would like to see any functionality, please go ahead and offer a question in the chat. But we did receive a few questions in the lead up to this event that we'd like to highlight or answer right now. The first question is, how often are the Global Health Budget Tracker and KFF's other global health budget resources updated? And for that, I'd like to hand that over to Stephanie.
Thanks for that question. We update our resources as soon as possible following the release of new data. For instance, the next milestone in the U.S. budget process will be later this week on Thursday with the President's budget request. So once that's released, we'll work to analyze that request to add in those amounts to this tracker. And if it's a skinny budget, and we're hearing that it is a skinny budget, we'll wait to update it until more detailed funding amounts are released. For the country level funding, we update whenever new data are available from foreignassistance.gov. Planned country level funding amounts are usually released within a few months of the conclusion of the fiscal year. And currently the tracker presents these amounts through FY21, and we anticipate that country data for FY22 will be available soon. FY23 data will likely not be available until later in the fall or the winter.
Thank you, Stephanie. We've had a number of questions come through, and so actually I'll take the first question. Is there a specific function to look at global gender programs? As of right now, no. A lot of the global health funding is not specifically divided by gender, but it's certainly something we would consider doing moving forward if that information becomes available. The next question was what about NCDs? And I'm wondering, actually, Stephanie, can you go to the budget tracker and pull up funding by NCDs? I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, we have funding for NTDs or NCDs, sorry.
Sorry, that was NCDs. Oh, no, actually, yeah, you're right. NTDs is available, but NCDs are not currently available because the U.S. global health budget is not, there's not a dedicated funding line for NCDs. So that's actually a great question, and apologies for misreading that initially. But if you want to go ahead while I look at some of the other questions, Stephanie, can just highlight NTDs real quick, that would be great.
Sure. We have NTD funding here, so you can select the funding type or the sector level funding over here. And then scroll to see details in the table.
Great, thank you. Another question came up about NCDs, and I think this is a good point to make, that we are tracking funding that is specified in global appropriations or by different departments and agencies that receive this funding. And so, as I mentioned before, NCDs are not specifically highlighted or separated out from these other program areas. And so I know there's been a lot of conversation about possibly doing that. And the OECD DAC has recently, I believe, added some reporting mechanisms for data going to them. But within the US system, funding is not dedicated specifically for NCDs. And so that's why we are not including it in this tracker here. Another question that came up was, why was Gavi broken out as a donor in the first pie chart and Global Fund, for example, was not? Actually, Stephanie, could you go back to that initial slide? Is that possible? And while you're pulling that up, I'll give a bit of background. So the data that's presented here is from the OECD DAC, which includes bilateral disbursements from donor governments as well as multilateral entities. So actually what you'll see is the US is the largest donor, but the Global Fund is listed as the second largest donor in country-to-country funding, along with Gavi, which is also highlighted there. If possible, I'd like to actually get to a question that another one that came in prior to the event, and that was, how do you account for regional and global funding? And for that, I'd like to pose that question to Anna.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The by geography tab is showing global health funding data to country identified recipients. So we do not include global or regional funding in that view as it's not identified by country. It's also important to know that countries could receive additional funding through global or regional mechanisms. However, it varies significantly by health sector. For example, in fiscal year 2021, global funding for HIV/AIDS received over $2 billion, while global funding for tuberculosis received nearly 86 million. So for this reason, we don't include global and regional funding in that view.
Great, thank you so much. And actually, there's a follow-up question on the regional funding. Do you show obligated or dispersed? This is actually planned funding. So in the US appropriations process, funding is provided by Congress, which is then provided to the different departments and agencies, which then plan the funding for where it's going to go. So this funding for, say, FY 2022, USAID will take the envelope of funds that they receive from Congress, determine what countries it will go to based on program area, and then report those amounts. That funding can actually be dispersed over a multi-year period. So FY 22 appropriations might not be dispersed for up to several years later. Hopefully that answers your question there. Another question that came in that I'd like to hand over to Stephanie is there more historical data older than 2026?
Thanks for that question. Well, so this tracker goes back to 2006 because that's basically the cutoff point for what is included on foreignassistance.gov. And these are the most detailed information we can get at this time. For some broad program areas, we do have data going back further. For instance, we have PEPFAR funding going back to 2004. For a number of program areas, though, the data prior to 2006 is not as detailed as we would like it to be to present it equally on the site. So if you're looking for other budget data prior to 2006, please do feel free to reach out to us directly, and we may be able to provide you with some of that specific data.
Thank you, Stephanie. Another question that I'll go ahead and answer that came in is, will you be able to track USAID's localization funding? That is not something we are doing right now. We've considered and trying to think of ways to possibly do that. And if we do, we will certainly reach out to this audience to let you know. But as of right now, no. There is another question that came in prior to the event that I'd like to pose to Stephanie. The KFF Global Health Budget Tracking work pulls from multiple data sources. How do you reconcile possible discrepancies or areas of confusion between these sources?
Thanks for that question. So one of the things that we do here at KFF is we make sure to triangulate the information. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure it's accurate and as most recent as possible by looking at multiple sources. And these sources include foreignassistance.gov, congressional appropriations bills and explanatory statements, and agency congressional budget justifications. In addition, we are in regular communication with OMB, agencies, and the Hill to double check that what we are presenting is accurate. So it's lots of triangulation and communication with agencies.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'm going to put you on the spot one more time because there was another question that came in beforehand that I think would be another opportunity to show how to use the tracker. And that's, how can I view U.S. funding for the global COVID-19 response?
Sure. Okay, so let's go to the overview. You can see global COVID-19 response by filtering for funding type. So COVID-19 funding was emergency supplemental funding. So you would go here. And then down in the table, you can click through here and expand it to see which of that emergency funding was COVID or Ebola or Zika.
Great.
All right here.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have one last question that came in beforehand. So I just want to, before I pose that, remind viewers we have a few minutes left. So if you do have any other questions, please put them in the chat. But what I'd like to do is get to that last question, which was about water, I believe. Yes, does the tracker include funding amounts for water? And Stephanie, I'll go ahead and hand that one to you as well.
Thanks. So water is a cross-cutting issue that receives both direct funding as well as funding provided through other program areas. And while foreignassistance.gov does include some funding data for water programs, we know these totals are not the full amount being provided, and therefore we've elected not to include them in the tracker.
Thank you, Stephanie. So what I'd like to do here as we prepare to wrap up is just to reiterate that this is being recorded, and we'll send a link to that recording to you after the event later today. And just say that we are always looking for new ways to present this data, to provide it to you, our audience, in a usable and easily accessible way that you can use for your work. So if you, as you go through the budget tracker, if you have any thoughts or ideas or additional questions, please do let us know. And we also have a number of other resources just that I'll highlight quickly. And that would be, we do budget summaries at key points in the budget process. So when the bills come out or the president's request comes out, we do quick summaries. We also have one-pagers that break down the budget by program area. So we encourage you to access those. And just like the budget tracker, let us know ways we can improve it or other ways that we can present the data that would be useful to you and the work that you're doing. So with that, with no other questions that have come through, I'd just like to take one last opportunity to thank you for joining us today, taking the time at your lunch hour to view this tool, to thank my colleagues Stephanie and Anna for presenting, and yes, encourage you one more time to let us know how we're doing and ways we can improve. So thanks again for your time, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.